The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, and Marcus Carter stepped out into a lobby that smelled like money and fresh paint. Not the good kind of money, the kind that had been arranged carefully, deliberately, to make people like him feel small before they even opened their mouths. He noticed the receptionist glance up, assess him in under 2 seconds, and glance back down. He noticed the way the chairs in the waiting area were positioned, facing a wall of glass that overlooked the city, so candidates would have their backs to the room. He noticed all of it and said nothing because Marcus Carter had spent 19 years noticing things that other people missed, and the habit had never fully left him. He gave his name to the receptionist. She typed something without looking at him and told him to take a seat. He sat. He did not look at his phone. He looked at the room. Ryland Acquisitions occupied the entire 14th floor of the Behringer Building in downtown Cincinnati. From the outside, it was the kind of firm that looked like every other mid-market private equity operation. Clean logo, glass facade, a name that gestured toward legacy without committing to it. From the inside, it was the same story. The furniture was expensive but not ostentatious. The art on the walls was abstract and safe. Everything said, "We are serious people, and you should want to impress us." Marcus had worked for firms like this before. He had also worked for firms nothing like this. The difference, in his experience, was almost never the furniture. He had driven 40 minutes to get here. His daughter Iris was at school until 3:15. He had done the math on the drive over. The interview was scheduled for 90 minutes, which meant he would be on the road by 2:30 at the latest, which meant he would be at the pickup line with 8 minutes to spare. He had called the school that morning to let them know he might be 5 minutes late, just in case. They had said that was fine. He had written the number for Iris's teacher in his phone under the label backup, and hoped he would not need it. He was always doing this kind of math. It had become second nature in the 3 years since Claire died. This constant, quiet arithmetic of time and contingency, the mental load of being the only person who knew where everything was, and what everything cost and what happened if any single piece of the calculation failed. It was exhausting in a way that was very difficult to explain to people who had not done it. He thought about this for a moment, then set it aside. He was good at setting things aside. A woman in a dark blazer came through the glass door at the far end of the lobby and walked toward him with her hand already extended. She introduced herself as Denise Yarrow, head of talent acquisition. Her handshake was firm and practiced. Her smile did not reach her eyes, but that was not necessarily a bad sign. Marcus had known excellent people with smiles like that. She led him back through the glass door, down a long hallway lined with framed portfolio summaries, and into a conference room with a long oval table and 4 chairs arranged on one side. There were 3 people already in the room. She introduced them in order: Graham Weld, the managing director, Patrice Duchesne, head of portfolio operations, and a younger man named Colt Ferris, who was identified as a senior analyst and whose role in the interview was not explained. Graham Weld was in his late 50s, the kind of man who had once been athletic and still carried himself that way. Patrice Duchesne had a legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand. Colt Ferris was looking at his laptop. Marcus shook hands with each of them and sat down across the table. The position was Director of Operational Strategy. He had applied 6 weeks ago after a friend from his old firm had mentioned that Ryland was expanding its portfolio management team and looking for someone with turnaround experience. The pay was good. The hours were described in the job listing as demanding but flexible. He had read that phrase 3 times before deciding it meant something close to what he needed it to mean. Graham Weld opened with the expected questions. Walk us through your background. What drew you to operational strategy as a discipline? Describe a turnaround you led that didn't go according to plan. Marcus answered each one directly. He did not oversell. He did not use the word passionate. He gave them specifics, numbers, timelines, decisions he had made, and why, outcomes both good and bad. He had been in enough rooms like this one to know that the people who talked about their work with the most precision were the people who actually understood it. Patrice Duchesne asked most of the follow-up questions. She was sharp, and her questions were good, and Marcus found himself respecting her without deciding to. Colt Ferris had not looked up from his laptop since the first minute. 40 minutes in, something shifted. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happened in rooms like this when the people asking questions had already made up their minds and were now simply waiting for the conversation to end. Marcus had felt it before, a slight change in posture, a question that was less pointed than the one before it, the pen going still on Patrice Duchesne's legal pad. Graham Weld glanced at his watch. Marcus noted all of it and kept his face neutral. Then Weld cleared his throat and said, "One thing we want to understand better is your current bandwidth. You mentioned during the screening call that you have a child in school. We want to make sure you have a clear-eyed view of what this role actually requires in terms of availability." The room did not change. The light was still the same. The table was still the same oval it had been for the past 40 minutes. Marcus looked at Weld for a moment before answering. "I do," he said. "I have a 9-year-old daughter. She's in 4th grade. And in terms of evening availability, weekend availability, I've managed teams through 3 turnarounds in the last decade. One of them was a 14-month engagement with a manufacturer in Columbus that required me on-site 4 days a week. I have a track record in demanding environments." "Of course," Weld said. "We're not questioning your professional record. We're thinking about fit. This role has a travel component that can be unpredictable. We want someone who can be fully present." The word fully landed with a particular weight. Marcus recognized the construction, the implication nested inside the professional language, the concern that could not be named directly because naming it directly would be illegal. He could have pushed back on it. He knew exactly how. Instead, he said, "I understand what you're asking." There was a pause. Weld said, "Want to be thorough?" "Of course," Marcus said. And then he said something that surprised even him. "I appreciate the candor. Let me be equally direct. I'm a single parent. That's a fact of my life, and I don't manage it by pretending it isn't there. I manage it the same way I manage everything else, by planning carefully, building good systems, and being honest when something is going to be a problem." He paused. "In 19 years of working in operational roles, I have never missed a deadline because of my family. I've missed deadlines for other reasons. Not that one." Nobody said anything for a moment. Weld nodded slowly. Duchesne had picked up her pen again. Colt Ferris was still looking at his laptop, but his typing had stopped. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. But the weight of the room had changed in a way that Marcus couldn't quite name, and by the time Denise Yarrow walked him back to the elevator and said they would be in touch, he understood that in touch meant what it usually meant when someone sent it in that particular tone. He pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. He stood in the elevator and looked at the numbers descending. He was not angry. He was something quieter than angry. A low, flat feeling that he associated with situations where the outcome had been decided by something other than what should have decided it. He had been in those situations before. Each time it took a few minutes to process and then it receded, because there was always something else that needed his attention. Today, that something else was Iris. He crossed the lobby and pushed through the glass doors into the October air. The street was loud and gray and ordinary. He found his car in the parking garage on the 3rd level, sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, and then started the engine. The drive home was quiet. He kept the radio off. He was 3 blocks from the school when his phone rang through the car speakers. He didn't recognize the number, but it was a Cincinnati area code, so he answered, "Mr. Carter." It was a man's voice, unhurried, not young. "This is Everett Ryland. I'm the founder of Ryland Acquisitions. I apologize for calling without warning." Marcus said nothing for a moment. He pulled to the curb. "I'm listening," he said. "I was in the building this afternoon," Ryland said. "I don't typically sit in on first-round interviews, but I review notes afterward, and I reviewed yours before Denise had finished typing them up. I also pulled your file." A brief pause. "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer it the same way you answered Graham's questions. Directly, all right. The Belhaven Group engagement in 2019. You were brought in as an interim operations director during their Chapter 11 restructuring. According to public filings, they emerged from bankruptcy in 14 months. According to what I know about that company, 14 months was roughly half the time anyone expected." Marcus waited. "That's accurate," he said. "The plan you submitted to the creditors committee in the 2nd month, the one that moved the primary distribution contracts from the subsidiary level to the parent, was not the plan the turnaround firm recommended." "No," Marcus said. "It wasn't. Whose plan was it?" "Mine." Ryland was quiet for a moment. "The turnaround firm had 3 times the personnel and twice the institutional history you had at that point. Why did the committee go with yours?" Marcus thought about how to answer that. He had told the story before in other rooms, but he had usually told a version of it, the version that emphasized the data and the modeling and the clear-eyed analysis. The version that sounded most like the thing people expected operational directors to say. Because their plan was designed to protect their relationship with the bank, he said. Mine was designed to save the company. Another pause. "I'd like to meet with you," Ryland said. "Not a panel interview, just a conversation. Tomorrow, if you're available." "There's a coffee shop I use on Sycamore. Halverson's." 8 in the morning, Marcus looked at the clock on the dashboard. He had 4 minutes before the school bell rang. "I'll be there," he said. He made it to the pickup line with 3 minutes to spare. Iris came out of the double doors with her backpack half unzipped and her hair coming loose from the braid he had done that morning. She climbed into the back seat and immediately said that Ava Brennan had told everyone at lunch that the class hamster had died, which it hadn't, because she had personally checked. Marcus said that seemed like important information to have verified. Iris said she thought so too. He pulled out of the line and headed home. In the rearview mirror, he watched her pull a library book from her backpack and open it across her knees. She read with the book too close to her face. He had told her this repeatedly. She did it anyway. He did not tell her about the phone call. There was nothing to tell yet, and there was no version of that story that was simple enough for the car ride home. That evening, after dinner, after dishes, after the homework argument that was less of an argument and more of a negotiation, after Iris was in bed and the house had gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet after 9 o'clock. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about what he had said in that conference room. "I've never missed a deadline because of my family." It was true. He believed it was true. But he also knew what it had cost to make it true. The specific kind of invisible labor that went into keeping that statement accurate. The planning, the contingency thinking, the calls to teachers, the calendar that was color-coded in a way he would never describe to anyone who hadn't needed to build something like it. The Belhaven engagement had required him to be in Columbus 4 days a week for 11 months. During those 11 months, Iris had stayed with Claire's sister on Tuesday and Wednesday nights. He had driven back every Thursday regardless of what was happening at the site. He had never once explained this to anyone at Belhaven, because explaining it would have made it someone else's problem, and it was not someone else's problem. He had not once missed a deadline, but he also knew there was a cost to doing things that way, and the cost was not visible in any of the documents or performance reviews or references that Everett Ryland had presumably reviewed before making that call. He did not know what Ryland wanted from the meeting. He had a guess, but he had learned not to trust guesses about things that mattered. He finished the coffee and went to bed. Halverson's was the kind of coffee shop that had been there long enough to stop trying to look like anything in particular. Wooden tables, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu above the counter. It smelled like espresso and something baked. Marcus arrived at 7:55 and ordered a black coffee and sat at a table near the window. Everett Ryland arrived at 8:02. He was older than Marcus had expected, early 70s, though he moved like a younger man. He was not tall. He wore a gray sport coat over a blue chambray shirt and no tie, and he carried a ceramic mug from the counter, which meant he had been here before and knew they'd let him bring his own. He sat down across from Marcus and looked at him for a moment in the way that certain people looked at things they were trying to understand. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for calling," Marcus said. Ryland set the mug down. "I want to tell you something before we talk about anything else. What happened in that room yesterday was a problem. I don't mean the interview process in general. I mean the specific turn the conversation took. That's not how I run a firm, and it's not something I was aware was happening until I read the notes." Marcus said nothing. "That's not an apology on behalf of the firm," Ryland continued. "It's information. I want you to know what I think about it before you decide whether this conversation is worth your time." Marcus considered that. "I appreciate it," he said. Ryland picked up the mug. "Tell me about your daughter." It was not a question Marcus had been expecting. He looked at Ryland for a moment. "Her name is Iris," he said. "She's 9. She reads everything she can get her hands on, including the backs of cereal boxes. She has a strong opinion about the class hamster. She does not zip up her backpack. How long have you been doing this alone?" 3 years. Ryland nodded. He didn't say he was sorry, which Marcus appreciated. People who said they were sorry sometimes wanted you to reassure them, and Marcus didn't have the energy for that today. "My wife ran the firm with me for 11 years, Ryland said. "She died in 2004. My youngest was 14. He paused. "I'm not equating the situations. I'm telling you what I know about what that math looks like from the inside." Marcus looked at him. "What I actually want to talk to you about," Ryland said, "is a portfolio company we acquired 18 months ago. A regional logistics firm in northern Kentucky, Galloway Freight, 160 employees. They've been running on a cost structure that was sustainable in 2018. and has not been sustainable since. We brought in a consulting group 6 months ago. They produced a report. The report was thorough and it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong the minute I read it, because it was built on assumptions about the business that were accurate on paper and inaccurate in practice. What kind of assumptions? That their driver retention problem was a compensation problem. Ryland shook his head. It's not. I've been in and out of that facility 4 times in the past year. The drivers who leave aren't leaving for more money. They're leaving because the dispatch system is broken and the route planning is done by a piece of software that was not designed for regional logistics. The drivers are doing the job of the software and they're burning out doing it. Marcus thought about this. What's your timeline before it becomes structural? Honest answer, 8 months. Maybe 10 if we make some temporary adjustments. And you want someone who can go in and fix the operations, not produce a report about fixing the operations. Ryland looked at him. The director of operational strategy role that Graham interviewed you for exists, he said. It's a real position with a real scope, but I am also thinking about something more specific in the short term. Galloway needs someone on the ground, not 4 days a week. I want someone in that building, understanding what's actually happening, and building a fix from the inside full-time, on-site, for the first phase, which I would estimate at 4 to 6 months. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The school is in Hyde Park, he said. Galloway is 31 minutes from Hyde Park, Ryland said. I looked it up. Marcus looked at him. I'm not trying to make this easier than it is, Ryland said. I'm telling you that I looked it up because I think that kind of detail matters, and because I wanted to show you that I understand there are details. Marcus thought about Iris with her library book held too close to her face. He thought about the color-coded calendar on the refrigerator. He thought about 11 months of driving home from Columbus every Thursday without exception, and about the way Iris had asked him, once, whether he was going to go away again for a long time, and about what it had cost him to say no, not like that. What's the compensation structure, he said. Ryland told him. Marcus did not react to the number, but he registered it. It was not what the director role had listed. It was more. And the director position, he said, is yours if you want it, when the Galloway engagement concludes. That was always the intent for someone with your profile. Graham was conducting a first-round interview. He was not conducting the final decision. Marcus set the coffee cup down. Outside the window, a city bus went past, and a woman with a stroller navigated around a crack in the sidewalk, and the October light was doing something particular to the street that made everything look both ordinary and temporary. I need to think about the logistics, he said. That's the correct answer, Ryland said. I'll need flexibility on school pickup twice a week, and I'll need to know in advance if something is going to run long, so I can make arrangements. That's reasonable. I'll have a clearer picture after I look at the Galloway operation. I'd want to visit the facility before I commit to anything. I expected that, Ryland said. I can arrange a visit for next week. Marcus nodded. He looked at Everett Ryland across the coffee table. At this man in his 70s who had looked up the drive time between a freight facility in northern Kentucky and a school in Hyde Park, who had pulled a file before the interview notes were finished, who had said that's not how I run a firm without using it as an opportunity to feel good about himself. Why this role? Marcus said. You have a full panel. You have a process. Why call me directly? Ryland was quiet for a moment. Because the Caldwell Group acquisition in 2021, he said. You were a consultant on that deal. You flagged a contingent liability in the environmental compliance filings that every other person on that transaction missed. I know because I was a minority investor in the acquiring entity, and I watched that liability get flagged and dismissed, and then become exactly the problem you said it would be. Marcus said nothing. The people who dismissed it were not incompetent, Ryland said. They were very competent. They missed it because they were looking at the documents the way documents are supposed to be looked at. You were looking at the documents as the way the company was actually operating. He picked up his mug. That's not a common thing. I remember the name on the memo. The coffee shop was filling up around them. Someone at the counter was describing a complicated order in a patient and optimistic voice. A child at the table by the door was eating a muffin with great seriousness. Marcus thought about what he had said in the elevator yesterday, not out loud, but the thing he had been thinking while the numbers descended. He had been thinking that he was tired of rooms where the furniture was expensive, and the decisions were small. He had been thinking that he was very good at his job, and that being very good at his job should have been, at this point in his life, The thing that determined what happened to him in rooms like that one. He picked up his coffee. "Tell me more about Galloway," he said. Ryland set down his mug and did. They were there for 2 hours. Marcus asked the kind of questions that made Ryland answer carefully, because they were questions that required careful answers. About the dispatch software, the route optimization failures, the specific contracts that were most at risk, the relationships between management and the driver pool, the consultant's report, and where exactly its assumptions had diverged from operational reality. By the end of it, Marcus had a clear picture of the problem and a preliminary shape of the solution, which was not something he usually had after a 2-hour conversation. It meant the problem was well-defined underneath the surface noise, and well-defined problems were, in his experience, the kind that could actually be solved. He drove to school pickup thinking about dispatch logic. Iris climbed into the back seat and said that the hamster situation had been fully resolved, and its name was Gerald. He said that was a solid name for a hamster. She said she thought so too. That night, after the dishes and the homework and the particular quiet of 9 o'clock, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and made 2 lists. One was the things that would need to change if he took the engagement. The other was the things that were possible to change and the things that were not. He wrote both lists with the same methodical attention he brought to everything that mattered, because this was how he handled decisions that had more than one kind of consequence. When he was done, the first list was shorter than he'd expected. The second list told him, clearly and without drama, that the things which were possible to change were enough. He thought about Iris asking whether he was going to go away for a long time. He thought about 31 minutes. He thought about a man who had looked up a drive time. He did not make the decision that night. He made it 3 days later, after the facility visit, after he had walked the Galloway operation from the loading dock to the dispatch office and confirmed, in the specific way that only direct observation could confirm, that the problem was exactly what Ryland had described it to be, and that he knew how to fix it. He called Everett Ryland from the parking lot of the facility, standing in the November wind with his hands in his jacket pockets. "He says he was in," Ryland said. "Good." That was the entirety of the conversation. Marcus drove home, stopping to pick up Iris early from her after-school program because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were for the Mexican place on Erie that she'd been going to since she was 5. They sat in the booth in the back, and she ordered the same thing she always ordered, and he ordered the same thing he always ordered, and she told him about a book she was reading in which a girl discovered a secret room in her grandmother's house, and he listened to all of it. The work that came after was hard, and it was long, and there were mornings when the math was tight, and evenings when the calendar required more from him than he had cleanly budgeted. But the math was always solvable, because he had built the systems to make it solvable, and because Everett Ryland had meant what he said about flexibility, and because Marcus Carter had been doing this long enough to know that the difference between manageable and unmanageable was almost never the size of the problem. It was whether the people around you understood what kind of problem it was. He did not arrive at any particular moment of triumph. There was no single day when everything changed and the shape of his life was suddenly different. What there was, instead, was a series of smaller moments that accumulated in the way that real things accumulated. A driver retention rate that climbed month over month, a dispatch system that started doing the job it was supposed to do, a team that gradually stopped bracing for the next thing to go wrong. And on a Thursday morning in March, Everett Ryland came to the Galloway facility for a quarterly review and sat across from Marcus in the same break room where Marcus had been eating lunch with the dispatch team for 4 months, and he looked at the numbers on the page in front of him and was quiet for a while. Then he said, "This is what I thought it would look like." Marcus said, "It's not finished yet." "No," Ryland said, "but the direction is right." He closed the folder, the director position. "We should talk about timing." Marcus thought about the calendar on the refrigerator. He thought about 31 minutes, which had turned out, in practice, to be 28. He thought about the Caldwell memo from 2021, that a man in his 70s had kept in his memory for 4 years, because the name on it had been attached to a way of looking at things that was worth remembering. He thought about Iris with her backpack unzipped, climbing into the back seat, telling him the hamster's name was Gerald with the confidence of someone reporting an important and settled fact. "Let's talk about timing," he said. The window of the break room looked out over the loading dock. A driver Marcus had worked with for 2 months, a quiet, dependable man named Sam Pruitt, was walking the line of trucks in the cold morning light, checking something on a clipboard with the focused attention of someone who had, recently, been given a system worth trusting. Marcus watched him for a moment. That was the part that stayed with him longest. Not the conversation in the lobby of the Behringer building. Not the call from a man who had looked up a drive time. Not the numbers on a quarterly review that had gone in the direction they were supposed to go. It was the driver on the loading dock in March light, doing his job with the particular steadiness of someone who no longer had to do someone else's job on top of his own. Marcus had gotten him that. He had gotten a lot of people that, over the course of a long career, and he knew it was not always visible from the outside, the specific thing he did and what it produced in the people he did it for. But it was visible from here, and that was enough.